I was standing in my own kitchen, wiping down countertops I had paid for in full 20 years ago, while my daughter-in-law complained about the brand of paper towels I bought. "These just don't absorb anything." "Judith," Sarah muttered, tossing a damp, crumpled sheet into the sink instead of the trash can. She didn't bother looking at me. She was too busy rearranging the cheese platter I had spent an hour preparing, moving the Gouda to the left so it would look better for her social media photos. I kept wiping the counter. I didn't argue. Arguing with Sarah was like trying to empty the ocean with a slotted spoon, exhausting and entirely pointless. 3 years ago, my husband passed away. Shortly after, my son David and his new wife Sarah asked to move into my finished basement. They claimed they needed 6 months to save for a down payment. I agreed, charging them a fraction of market rent. I thought I was helping my son build a foundation. Instead, I had imported a daily headache. 6 months turned into 36. Their savings account seemed to be exclusively directed toward European vacations designer handbags and weekend brunch tabs. Meanwhile, Sarah treated my home like a boutique hotel where the staff me was constantly underperforming. Outside in the backyard, the grill hissed. It was David's 30th birthday party, an event Sarah had insisted on hosting at my house because her apartment-dwelling friends needed space to breathe. About 30 people were currently trampling my flower beds and drinking the expensive wine I had specifically hidden in the back of the pantry. David walked in holding an empty beer bottle. He tossed it onto the counter, missing the recycling bin entirely. "Mom, we need more ice. Can you run to the gas station?" I looked at the bottle, then at my 30-year-old son. "I'm in the middle of cleaning David. You have legs." He sighed heavily, casting a glance at Sarah. "Come on, Mom. I'm hosting. Be a team player." I wiped my hands on a towel, folding it neatly over the oven handle. The disrespect wasn't loud, but it was constant. A slow, dripping faucet, eroding my patience. I grabbed my purse, stepping past them. I would get the ice, but I already knew something had to change. I just didn't realize how soon the breaking point would arrive. The backyard was suffocatingly humid, filled with the loud chatter of Sarah's friends. I placed the fresh bags of ice in the cooler, my back aching slightly from the heavy lifting. Nobody offered to help. David was busy showing off his new watch to a coworker, a watch I knew cost more than my first car. An hour later, the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the lawn. Sarah tapped her acrylic nails against a wine glass. The sharp, clinking sound cut through the music. "Everyone gather around!" David called out, wrapping his arm around Sarah's waist. He looked flushed, beaming, with an unearned sense of accomplishment. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate with me. But we actually have a bigger reason to celebrate today." I stood by the patio door, arms crossed, watching the performance. "Sarah and I finally closed on a house," David announced. Cheers erupted. People clapped, raising their glasses. I raised an eyebrow. They hadn't mentioned a single word about house hunting to me. "It's a gorgeous 5-bedroom place in Oak Creek," Sarah chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "We're finally getting the space we deserve." David cleared his throat, holding up a hand to quiet the crowd. "Of course, big houses come with big mortgages, but we're incredibly lucky." He turned his gaze directly toward me. The smile on his face was wide, but his eyes were calculating. "Because Mom has generously agreed to pay our new mortgage from now on. It's her way of investing in her future grandchildren." The guests oohed and ahed. A few people turned to look at me, clapping politely. They were applauding my supposed generosity. I felt the air leave the patio. He hadn't asked me. He hadn't even hinted at this. He was using the crowd, the public pressure, assuming I would just smile, nod, and open my checkbook to avoid making a scene. I walked slowly through the crowd. The clapping faded as people noticed the flat, cold expression on my face. I stopped a few feet from my son. "I am doing no such thing," I stated clearly, my voice carrying over the quiet yard. David's smile faltered. Mom, come on, we talked. We talked about nothing. I cut him off. I looked him straight in the eye, then glanced at Sarah's shocked face. And since you clearly have money for a 5-bedroom house, your lease here ends today. I turned my back on the silence and walked inside. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. I woke up at my usual time, 6 o'clock, and brewed a pot of dark, roast coffee. I sat by the window, watching the early light filter through the oak trees. I knew David and Sarah thought I was being dramatic. They assumed my declaration the night before was just a burst of anger, something that would fade after a good night's sleep. They relied on my history of keeping the peace, but the peace was gone, and I had no intention of rebuilding it. Around 9, heavy footsteps thumped up the basement stairs. David appeared in the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, wearing sweatpants. He reached for a mug in the cabinet and poured himself coffee. Look, Mom, he started, keeping his back to me. About last night, you embarrassed us in front of everybody. Sarah was crying in the bathroom for an hour. I took a slow sip of my coffee. She'll survive. He turned around, frowning. You didn't have to be so harsh. We just figured since the house is paid off, you have all that extra money from Dad's life insurance. You could help us out. I let you live here for 3 years for next to nothing. I replied, my tone perfectly even. That was my help. You abused it. So what? David scoffed, leaning against the counter. You're actually kicking us out over a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an ambush, I corrected him. And yes, you are leaving. I told you your lease ended yesterday. He rolled his eyes, clearly unconvinced. Right. Okay, Mom. We'll talk when you've calmed down. He took his mug and retreated down the stairs. I didn't yell after him. I didn't need to. I walked over to the hallway closet and pulled out the step stool. I reached the top shelf where the internet router sat. I unplugged the cables, wrapped the cord neatly around the black box, and placed it inside a heavy canvas tote bag. They like to spend their Sundays streaming movies and scrolling on their phones. Let them see how comfortable the basement was, without a connection to the outside world. By noon, the heavy thumping on the stairs returned. This time, it was Sarah. She marched into the living room, clutching her phone like it had personally offended her. Judith, did the Wi-Fi go down? She demanded, not bothering with a greeting. I didn't look up from the book I was reading. I disconnected it. She stopped pacing. Why David needs to check his emails for work. David works on Mondays, I replied, turning a page. And you both need to start packing. The internet is a privilege for residents. You are now guests who have overstayed. Sarah let out a sharp, mocking laugh. You're actually serious. You think you can just throw us out on the street? You have a 5-bedroom house in Oak Creek, I reminded her. You won't be on the street. She flushed deeply, her jaw tightening before spinning around and stomping back downstairs. I closed my book. Shutting off the Wi-Fi was a minor inconvenience, but it was just the beginning. I went into my home office and opened my laptop. I logged into my banking portal. 2 years ago, when David's car broke down, I added him as an authorized user to my primary credit card. It was meant strictly for emergencies. Lately, emergencies had evolved to include gourmet sushi deliveries and designer sneakers. I clicked on the account management tab. I found David's name. With 2 simple clicks, I revoked his access. The physical card in his wallet was now nothing more than useless plastic. Next, I reviewed the joint checking account I had opened with him when he was in college. There was only a few $100s in it, mostly my money left over from old transfers. I transferred the balance entirely to my private account. I didn't feel angry as I clicked through the screens. I felt incredibly light. For 3 years, I had been carrying the weight of two able-bodied adults who refused to carry themselves. I closed the laptop and picked up my keys. It was time to run some errands, and I knew exactly what would happen while I was gone. I returned home 2 hours later. The moment I unlocked the front door, I could feel the tension vibrating in the air. David was pacing the kitchen, his phone pressed to his ear. Sarah was sitting at the dining table, her arms crossed tight against her chest, glaring fiercely at the wall. A reusable grocery bag sat empty on the floor. David hung up the phone as soon as he saw me. "Mom, what did you do to the credit card?" I placed my purse on the hook by the door. "I canceled it." "I was at the checkout at Whole Foods," Sarah snapped, standing up quickly. "I had a cart full of groceries and the cashier declined the card, in front of a line of people." "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? You should try paying with your own money," I suggested calmly, walking past her to put the kettle on. "I find that usually prevents humiliation." David rubbed his temples, his face red. "Mom, you can't just cut us off without warning. We have bills. We need groceries." "You bought a new house yesterday," I noted, striking a match to light the stove. "If you can afford a mortgage, you can afford a carton of milk." "That house is a new build," Sarah shouted, losing her composure. "We haven't even paid the full deposit yet. We were counting on your help to finalize the paperwork." I turned around, slowly holding a tea bag. "You spent 3 years living in my basement to save for a house. Instead, you spent my money on yourselves, committed to a mortgage you couldn't afford, and tried to bully me into paying for it in front of 30 people." I dropped the tea bag into a mug. "The bank is closed to you. Both of you." David stared at me, opening his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He looked exactly like he did when he was 7 and caught stealing cookies. Guilty, panicked, and out of excuses. "Pack your bags," I added quietly, "because the next thing I cut off will be the hot water downstairs." The reality of the situation was slowly sinking into their thick skulls, but they still thought they held some leverage. Monday morning arrived. I was outside watering my hydrangeas when David walked out the front door, spinning a key ring on his finger. He was heading straight for the silver sedan parked in the driveway. The car I had bought 5 years ago. The car I let him use daily for his commute because Sarah demanded the SUV for her consulting gigs. "David," I called out, turning off the garden hose. "Where are you going?" He paused, looking annoyed. "To work, Mom. Where else?" "Not in my car, you aren't." I walked over to the driveway, holding out my hand. "Keys." He let out a loud, frustrated groan. "Are you kidding me? I'm going to be late. You want me to take the bus?" "Sarah is sitting right inside. She can drop you off." I kept my hand extended. "The car is registered to me. The insurance is paid by me. Give me the keys." "Mom, this is ridiculous," he argued, gripping the keys tighter. "You're punishing us for trying to build a future." "I'm reclaiming my property," I corrected him. "You have 10 seconds before I go inside. Get my spare and move it myself." He stared at my outstretched hand. For a moment, I saw a flash of real defiance in his eyes. But David was at his core a coward when faced with actual consequences. He slammed the keys into my palm. "You're ruining my life," he muttered, turning back toward the house. I didn't answer. I got into the sedan, adjusted the mirror, and backed out of the driveway. I didn't just leave it on the street. I drove 3 blocks down to my neighbor Helen's house. I had called her earlier. She opened her garage door, and I parked my car safely inside. When I walked back to my house 10 minutes later, Sarah's SUV was peeling out of the driveway, David in the passenger seat, looking furious. I smiled, enjoying the morning breeze. They were finally experiencing the cost of independence. By Wednesday, they still hadn't packed a single item. I knew this because I had walked down to the basement while they were at work. The space was a disaster. Clothes thrown over chairs, empty expensive takeout containers on my coffee table, and an overflowing trash bin. They were playing a waiting game, assuming my anger had an expiration date. They were wrong. I drove to the local hardware store and bought 20 large, heavy-duty cardboard boxes, 2 rolls of packing tape, and a thick black marker. When I got home, I carried the supplies downstairs. I started in their living area. I didn't throw things blindly. I folded David's designer shirts. I neatly stacked Sarah's endless collection of beauty products. I packed their framed photos, their expensive electronics, their shoes. I didn't damage a single item. I just meticulously removed their existence from my house. Every time I taped a box shut, the basement felt a little brighter, a little more like mine again. It took me 4 hours of steady work. I dragged each taped box up the stairs and stacked them neatly in the garage. By 5 o'clock, the basement was completely bare, save for the furniture that belonged to me. I went to my kitchen drawer and pulled out the spare keys to the basement door, the heavy wooden door that separated their downstairs unit from the rest of the house. I locked it from my side. The only way they could get in now was through the exterior garage door, which currently led only to a wall of their own cardboard boxes. I washed my hands, made a simple chicken salad for dinner, and sat at the dining table. The evening sun cast a warm, golden glow across the floorboards. I ate slowly, savoring the absolute silence of a house that finally belonged only to me. I checked my watch. They usually got home around 6. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and waited for the show to begin. At exactly 6:15, the heavy hum of Sarah's SUV vibrated in the driveway. I heard the car doors slam, followed by the familiar sound of their complaining voices carrying through the front yard. Instead of coming through the front door, they walked around the side of the house to enter through the garage, their usual route to the basement. I stood up, holding my glass of iced tea, and walked to the door that connected the kitchen to the garage. I opened it slightly, just enough to watch. The garage door rattled as David pushed it up. Sunlight flooded the dusty concrete floor, illuminating the towering wall of 20 cardboard boxes stacked perfectly in the center. David stopped dead in his tracks. Sarah nearly bumped into him. "What the hell is this?" Sarah shrieked, dropping her designer handbag onto the concrete. David stepped closer to the boxes, reading the black marker labels. Sarah's shoes, David's clothes, bathroom supplies. He reached out and pushed the handle of the interior basement door. It didn't budge. He rattled it harder. "Mom!" David yelled, banging his fist against the wood. "Mom, open this door!" I opened the kitchen door fully and stepped down the 2 stairs into the garage. I took a sip of my tea, looking at them over the rim of the glass. "You didn't pack," I said simply. "So I did it for you." Sarah's face turned an ugly shade of red. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You touched my things. You have no right to touch my things. This is illegal." "I packed them very carefully," I replied, ignoring her outburst. "Everything is accounted for. Where are we supposed to sleep?" David demanded, his voice cracking with panic. He finally realized this wasn't a game. "We don't close on the house for another month. We have nowhere to go. I suggest you cancel the European vacation you booked for September and use those funds for an extended stay motel," I suggested. "There's a perfectly adequate one right off the highway." They stood there surrounded by the physical proof of their eviction. No lawyers, no dramatic letters, just cardboard tape and a locked door. Sarah completely lost whatever thin veneer of control she had left. She kicked the nearest box, denting the cardboard. "You are a bitter, selfish, old woman," she screamed, the echo bouncing off the garage walls. "We are family. You have thousands of dollars sitting in the bank doing nothing, and you're kicking your own son out onto the street. I am protecting my peace, I answered, keeping my voice low and steady. You came into my home, drained my resources, disrespected my space, and then tried to publicly humiliate me into funding a lifestyle you haven't earned. I turned my gaze to David. He looked pale, his hands running frantically through his hair. "David, say something," Sarah demanded, pushing his shoulder. "Tell her we aren't leaving." David looked at me, pleading. "Mom, please, just let us back inside. We'll pay rent. Actual rent. We'll stop asking for money." "You don't have money to pay actual rent, David, and I don't want your money anyway. I want my house back." I set my iced tea down on a nearby workbench. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I handed it to him. He unfolded it with shaking hands. "What is this?" "A list of cheap motels in a 20-mile radius," I said, "and the phone number of a U-Haul rental place." Sarah snatched the paper from his hand, tore it in half, and threw it on the ground. "We are not leaving. I will call the police. You can't lock us out." I looked at her completely unfazed. "If you want to sit in my driveway and explain to the neighbors why you're throwing a tantrum, because I won't pay your mortgage, be my guest." But the door stays locked. I didn't wait for her next scream. I turned around, walked back up the stairs, and closed the kitchen door. I locked the deadbolt. A heavy thud hit the door a second later, followed by Sarah's muffled screaming, but I simply walked away. I went to the living room, turned on the television, and found a cooking show. The volume easily drowned out the noise from the garage. It took them 3 hours to admit defeat. From the living room window, I watched David and Sarah load the rented van in absolute silence. Sarah's makeup was ruined, and David looked utterly defeated. There were no grand apologies or tearful goodbyes. When they finally drove away, my driveway was empty for the first time in 3 years. A quiet morning. The next morning, I woke at 6, brewed my dark roast coffee, and walked down to the basement. I opened the windows to let the crisp breeze sweep away the stale air. Looking at the empty corners, I began happily planning a new sewing room or a quiet reading space. Upstairs, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "We're at a motel. Sarah is furious. We might lose the deposit on the house. I hope you're happy." I read it twice, feeling no rush of guilt, only a profound sense of detachment. He was an adult and had to figure it out himself. I typed a brief reply, "I am happy. Budget wisely." I silenced my phone, walked out to my back patio, and smiled. Surrounded by blooming hydrangeas and sunshine, I finally drank my coffee in absolute peace.